Good evening. My name is Eric Kirk. I'm with Chuck Rogers. This is Redwood Wonk on Access Humboldt and KZZH. We have the biggest news today is the verdict of yesterday. The verdict of Derek Chauvin, the officer who killed George Floyd. And I mean, there's so much to talk about as to whether it's going to have an impact politically. We'll talk a little bit about some of the reactions to it, and a little bit of a discussion about. I'm a little bit concerned about the judge after making some comments about how Maxine Waters might have opened up an appeal. I don't agree. I think that would be a bogus thing to say, but it is. There's definitely a different reaction to this verdict depending on your political ideology. And I want to talk about all of that. But first, guilty on all three counts: second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and manslaughter. That does not mean he has to serve sentences for all of them. They're kind of lesser included. He can only they would be served concurrently, basically. And so the maximum of second-degree murder of 40 years would be the maximum that he could face. I will, at the end of the show, my prediction will be about what that sentence will be. But there's so much to talk about with that and its impact on race relations, the optimism that was out there, but then a few hours later there was another killing. We'll talk a little bit about that in Columbus, Ohio. Very different circumstances, but still an ongoing problem about the interactions of police forces in particularly Black communities and dealing with young Black people in particular. Chuck, where'd you like to go?
Yeah, one of my first reactions to this was to realize that we may not have had this guilty verdict, maybe not even a trial, had there not been passersby with smartphones who were, by now people are, quick to push record on their phone cameras. Without that, I'm not sure there would have even been a trial, because let's remember the first statement released by the Minneapolis Police Department before they knew there was video was that George Floyd died at the hospital after a medical incident. Clearly, there was testimony at the trial that Floyd died on the ground under the knee of Officer Chauvin. And the jury found that that's what caused the death or brought it about at that time. So, I'm glad that there was a guilty verdict. I'm glad that maybe there's some momentum in the direction of policing reform and criminal justice reform. Maybe we can talk about that later. But I think we need to remember that this would not have happened were it not for members of the general public pressing record on their smartphones.
Well, particularly the 17-year-old girl showing incredible bravery, being right there, and could possibly have been arrested. With the BART, I think we talked about this last night, with the BART cop shooting the guy who was down on his back about a decade ago. The police there tried to seize all of the phones. They literally went across ran through the BART station, catching up with anybody who had taken pictures, and only two people managed to get away. One, a young Latina woman, probably about the same age as this woman, who got onto a train with one of the officers pounding on the window and pointing at her phone and giving this indication. And she shook her head, went to the next station and ran out and ran home as soon as she could and got it onto YouTube. But that's not, and those are two instances because we have phones now that you're almost guaranteed if it's in a crowded place in daylight that it's going to end up on camera. But that's no guarantee of anything. Eric Garner, also an I Can't Breathe case, was on film. On camera. We've had numbers of them on camera, and they still will hold their investigations and in front of the grand jury break it down into milliseconds like they did with Rodney King. Well, here he's trying to resist when, it's really, everything really is happening a lot faster than that, but they slow it down and kind of dilate time to be able to do it. But what was different this time is that it wasn't a split-second thing that could be spread out. This happened over 9.5 minutes. We talked about this last week, and the video just goes on and on and on with him screaming, "I can't breathe," calling for his mother, and people around yelling at him, "Get off him! You're killing him!" And him not responding. And just feeling like, hey, I'm the officer, I'm the expert. I don't care if you're an EMT. I don't care. You're all being rowdy. Keep your distance. And just didn't even change it. And, but the difference this time was the blue wall of silence, as we discussed last week, has fallen. There were officers, including the superior officer, who testified against him. Would he have done it if it wasn't on film? I don't know. But there has to be a point where officers, not even just as a matter of conscience, we don't expect that because the culture of silence is strong. The culture of rounding the wagons when you get, when something like this happens is strong. But there has to be a point when officers worry about their own safety. Every time, you talked about it a couple of weeks ago, there's more guns than people, so every pullover is amped up anyways. And if you're a young African American man and you're pulled over and you're worried that maybe you won't survive the outcome, and there is a gun in the car, that's dangerous for everybody. And so we need to in order to back off of that intensity that leads to these incidents, we need justice like this. We need verdicts like this, because now every cop in the nation will listen when somebody says, "I can't breathe." Now, maybe people will try to use that, to their advantage, but you damn well take your knee off of their neck, period. End of story.
Well, let me follow up on that with you. I know that we're going to talk about what this means and what might happen and what kind of momentum there is after this verdict. But let's spend just a minute here on this question. What do you think the reaction of police departments is going to be? Not legislative folks in Washington or St. Paul or Sacramento or anywhere else, but what's the reaction of police departments going to be after this?
It's mixed. There've been interviews. NPR has done some interviews. I heard some this morning. I listen to NPR when I wake up in the morning, and and they are interviewing officers. Plenty of officers say that they needed this verdict. Plenty of police chiefs. Others are saying, well, you're just you don't know what it's like to be out there. It's a crazy world out there, and to hold them accountable, especially since we don't know what the cause of death was. We do know what the cause of death was. The defense tried to raise the defense by throwing everything against the wall, hoping something will stick. Was it the exhaust? Was it a heart failure? Was it drug addiction? And of course, using that to stigmatize not just the victim, but even the people around. Here's an unruly mob of black people that we had to deal with, right? And the jury did not go for that. I mean, They were very firm. And if you listen to the roll call, those jurors are very firm. There's no weakness, no ambiguity in their voice. They were very firm with their decision. I look forward to when somebody scores an interview with one or two of them. So, it's different. It's unique cases. A unique case in many ways, but not all that different from Eric Garner. It's very similar. "I can't breathe" is the same thing. So when somebody says, "I can't breathe," you need to loosen up. You're the professional. You're the cop. I know you're worried for your own safety in that situation, but you need to make sure that he's not just making it up, and that means you need to ease up a little bit. Sorry if that, somebody might try to misuse that in the future, but you're out there. You need to take care not to kill somebody that way. And the fact that the grand jury let the officer who choked Eric Garner to death, I see as one of the major travesties. Some of the others are kind of ambiguous, like this killing yesterday in Columbus, Ohio. I'm not absolutely sure about that. I go back and forth. I've been watching that video a few times. We can talk about that in a few minutes. But this was not a split-second decision of life or death. He was on, was on Mr. Floyd's neck for almost 10 minutes.
Yeah.
A long time.
Well, and let's not forget one of the physicians who testified, who went through the video of the incident almost second by second, testified that George Floyd was dead a full 3.5 minutes or so. I may not have that time exactly right, but approximately 3.5 minutes after. He died at about 6 minutes into there, but the knee was on his neck until 9.5. So the knee was on his neck for a full 3.5 minutes after he had already died.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that shows a lack of any kind of concern on the part of that officer in that moment. But let me also ask you this. There have been people already today talking about how this could affect policing reform, criminal justice reform, and so on. I'm all for that. But will that be successful if we do not do anything about the violent nature of society that police have to deal with? If police remain on edge because they're trying to enforce laws in a violent society, all of the reform that you could possibly imagine may not do any good until we do something about the violence in our own society, right?
Well, yeah, we have to address, and we on the left talk often about root causes, whereas on the right they'll talk about individual agency. Were they responsible? Did they act responsible in this particular incident? As if every incident is completely separate. And I do agree we need to evaluate each incident on its own terms, but there is always a backdrop of racism, of implicit bias, and yes, we do have to address causes. Like, okay, what happened with these girls yesterday? I don't know. The body cam goes on, and you're not quite sure what's happening. There's 3 girls involved, and one girl is going after another girl. They're on the ground, and then all of a sudden that girl falls, and the cop is saying, "Hey, stop!" And the one girl has a knife and goes right at the girl in pink who's against the car, has her pinned against the car. Was she going to stab her? Was she just going to threaten her? We don't know, but it was very confusing. Everything split second. So even if we exonerate that officer who may very well have saved the other girl's life, we'll never know for sure, But he went in there. There's another African-American officer there who, I don't know if he drew his gun, but he definitely didn't fire his gun. It was the white guy who fired his gun. Mm-hmm. All right. Maybe he had the right angle, all of that to make it safe for the other girl, but he shot 4 bullets into her. And the question is, are they prepared to go into these situations? As Sean King raised, there are numerous incidents in which there are white people who have knives, who don't get shot. Now, sometimes they do. Right here in Eureka, about a decade or so ago, there was a troubled kid, who came out of the woods and was shot by I think it was a sheriff deputy. I'm not sure. It might have been a Eureka police, but and shot to death. And he was about 30 feet away, from what I remember, and he was exonerated. Right? We do have that in here. We have a woman who a few months later was shot in Old Town in her apartment when she reached for a flare gun. Right? I mean, we do see it happen, but there are situations in which police come in and first have a diffusing approach, diffuse it, separate, and are able to do it even when one of them has a knife. They don't necessarily have to shoot somebody with a knife. Could anything have been done? Everybody's saying, well, why didn't he tase her? I don't know. There's a bit of different distance between them, not a lot of time, and tasing doesn't automatically make you drop instantaneously. Even if she'd been tased, would she have still stabbed the other girl? What were her intentions? I empathize with the officer in there. Tough decision. I think it's much different from Floyd, but we still have to discuss the context. Why was this fight even happening? What are the social circumstances that led to these 2 girls going to the home of this teenage girl and picking a fight with her. Why was she so terrified that she went into the kitchen? She made the call, by the way, the first call of 2 calls to the police. And then why was she so terrified that she felt she had to run into the kitchen, grab a knife, and come out and go after the 2 girls with? We may learn more about that story later, but what were the conditions that led to that? What are these officers training to be able to ascertain that when they hear about it? Now maybe they didn't hear there was a knife or all that, and they were just going because it was reported as a potential fight or something like that. But as this guy is riding in and he sees a group of African Americans outside in a very confusing situation, would his instinctive reactions been different if everybody had been white? I don't know. And if his reactions had been different and they were white and he was slower to shoot, would that have meant the one girl got killed? I don't know. But we need to ask these questions and address them in the reform as to, and there must be implicit bias training in all officers, anybody with that kind of power.
Well, that gives me another follow-up question, and that is this. You just outlined a very complicated social situation and we're talking about an incident for our viewers, an incident that happened in Columbus, Ohio. I used to live there, actually. But you just described a very complicated situation. So how does policing reform or criminal justice reform even begin to address a situation like that?
Well, for one thing, you got to have some training that addresses and says, you as a white officer, you may have implicit bias that may have some impact on your decision making. When you're driving into a situation, be conscious of that. Be aware of it ahead of time, and think, okay, if this situation is going to be potentially crazy, how am I going to respond to it? No guarantee that that's going to work, but at least if you're aware of it going in, instead of treating every situation the same because you believe that you're colorblind. Again, I don't know if that would have made any difference, yesterday. I have no idea in that particular incident, but it could save lives. I mean, this Chauvin verdict will save lives. People will not be killed. Mostly Black people, but even some other people will not be killed because of that verdict. This one, and some of the others where it's instantaneous. This isn't an officer shooting somebody in the back who's trying to get away, like the one in South Carolina. That guy actually is being prosecuted too. But this was a split-second decision where we don't know what would have happened if he'd acted any differently. But let's at least make sure that he's aware of his own limitations of dealing with stuff going into it, so he can maybe prepare. I don't know if that, it has to make a decision in those split-second decisions that maybe keep a 6-year-old with a toy gun from being shot, or somebody with a wallet. There's actually a YouTube video going around that has a white guy who came out and had his hands up and with a wallet in his hand. They thought it was a gun. They shot him. He survived, luckily, but he was shot on the ground, several years ago. Again, not being on edge with these types of things, might help. I understand split second. Guy comes out, you think it's a gun, it's you or him, and then it turns out to be a wallet. But see what the MAGA world will say is, well, he should have followed instructions, not come out of the car and not held his wallet up. This girl should, when the police arrived, should not have been, chasing people around with a knife. But who knows how terrified she was that put her into that frenzy. I mean, and maybe if they'd come in with their sirens on, because if they'd been informed that it was a very similar situation, would that have let her know, help is here? Would that have? I mean, I don't know. And we got to look at that, and we got to look at it in terms of understanding that there may be different reactions of the same cop depending on what community there is in, and there's still probably going to be, incidents like that where things happen, and there'll still probably be incidents of power, cops who are really into their power and not listening, but maybe there'll be fewer of them. And Certainly this doesn't happen so much in other countries, and we need to look at all the factors.
Well, does the Chauvin case and verdict also tell us that maybe we need to do something different in recruiting police officers? Or if not in recruiting, at least in the interviews and in the training. I wonder how this might affect human resources folks in local, state, and federal offices who are trying to hire law enforcement officers. Does this change the questions they ask? Does it change the types of people they look for? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm not an expert. I think there needs to be a real discussion. A lot of that is addressed in the George Floyd bill that's in Congress right now, but there's so many of the Republicans right now claiming that this verdict was due to Maxine Waters, saying that you should be in the streets ready to be confrontational, and saying that she's calling for riots, and therefore the jurors were afraid that they were going to be murdered or that the city was going to burn down, and so therefore they were forced to give that verdict. I can't wait to hear from the jurors about that, because I really don't think that's the case. They were firm in that, but we do need to look at it. I just don't know. I think we need to have a discussion about that. But the George Floyd bill has a lot of good stuff in it.
Was it proper or improper for the judge to say from the bench during the trial to the defense attorney that what Maxine Waters said might be grounds for appeal?
That's what has me concerned about the sentencing, but we'll talk about that later.
Okay.
It was way inappropriate. You don't provide legal assistance. You stay out of it, But he was saying in the context of denying the motion for a mistrial. They also wanted to blame Biden because Biden said he prayed for a verdict and the evidence was clear. But when Biden did it, the jury had already been sequestered. They weren't going to hear from him about him. So. Anyway, I have plenty more to talk about that in future shows. I think the fallout will come in, but I do believe that this is a catalyst for change. Listening to George Floyd's brother tonight on NPR, really impressed.
I, Richard Billhouse Nixon, do solemnly swear.
I, Gerald R. Ford, do solemnly swear.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
I, William Jefferson Clinton, do solemnly swear.
I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., do solemnly swear. So help me God.
Okay, infrastructure. We know there is, over $2 trillion infrastructure bill proposed by the Democrats and by President Biden. The Republicans were struggling to even come up with a response. I don't even know if it's been formally introduced or whether or not they're going to support it, but they have a much more scaled down version that would be about $600 billion. Mm-hmm. And the big fight is over what constitutes infrastructure. And we discussed that somewhat last week. And of course, the Republican proposal basically addresses infrastructure as roads and bridges and oil pipes.
Yeah.
I mean, that's it. Maybe something for the grid, but certainly not to revamp the grid to make it green or, addressing climate change. Democrats have a much more expansive concept, and they also see this not just as as an infrastructure bill, but also restructuring our economy, taking the opportunity to do that, emphasizing certain types of green technology over others, and addressing economic development in certain parts of the community, educational stuff. A big argument over whether education is infrastructure, right? I mean, and it's anyway. The Democrats are saying, almost saying, don't even bother trying to put it on the floor. It's dead on arrival. And so this could be, one of those that gets passed through reconciliation without, on a strict vote, assuming they can get Manchin and Sienna on board. Seems like they can, but this is going to be huge because this is what may save the economy later. In our next segment, we're going to talk a little bit about inflation. I'm going to talk about why that's important in that context. But in this one, it looks like the Republicans have put up what is, considered to be inadequate to the Democrats.
Yeah, I think it's $600 billion, which is less than a third of what the Democrats are proposing. At last check, I do not think that the Republicans have introduced a bill. But that could have happened today, and I'm just not aware of it. But I don't think that they've introduced anything. I'm somebody who tends to have a fairly broad definition of infrastructure, and that is, anything that helps to keep our society going and moving and working and being somewhat equitable. So, I'm glad that there are things in there like for home care, for example, for broadband. To me, the $2.2 trillion Democrat plan seems to me to focus on what we need in the 21st century, and the Republican plan, such as it is, just doesn't. And the frustrating thing for me, though, is something like infrastructure would necessarily, I think common sense would inform us, impact everybody, regardless of political party. So I would think that red states would welcome a large infrastructure plan that would fix the roads and the bridges and the pipelines, but also do a lot of other things, especially in rural communities that sometimes get overlooked. So it's baffling to me why a Republican from a red state would not see this as an opportunity. But apparently it's party over everything else at this point.
Well, also the Club for Growth and the Chamber, not liking how much money spent, although the Chamber across the country are different on that. Some of them do want money spent on infrastructure because it's way overdue for some of this stuff. Broadband, and talking about free broadband, access to broadband for marginalized and poor communities is definitely something that is infrastructure. No, there wouldn't have been any question about it, 30, 40 years ago, if it existed, that it would be. Because we talked about telephone lines, we talked about TV towers, the big red and white thing down in San Francisco that's ugly, but was built, was in an infrastructure bill. I mean, it's just, everything. And basically I see infrastructure as, that which needs to keep society moving, which cannot be adequately addressed in the market system, in the free market, that by private ownership. So, this is going to be a big discussion. And again, Biden has a vision and the Democrats have their slim majority. They just have to make sure they're unified on it. The Republicans, it's like, they had 4 years to pass their alternative health care plan. They never even introduced it. They don't have one. I think they can't reach an agreement on it because there's so many people who say we can't spend that much money, and why not let the private sector deal with it? Some of them advocate privatization of roads, like the goofy turnpike systems in the Midwest and on the East Coast, which I find absolutely, the fact that you got to keep putting dimes in as you're driving, it's just absolutely ridiculous. Actually not dimes anymore. It's just it's expensive, and a poor person can't travel from one town to the other on that thing.
Right. Let me go back to something you mentioned. That's the Chamber of Commerce, and it is true that there are some local chambers of commerce around the country that have said we need this, but not many of them. But the ones who are saying we need this have an interesting point, and I agree with it. When we are working on large infrastructure projects, wherever they may be, wherever they are, those projects put money in the pockets of local workers and local businesses and drives the local economy while those projects are underway, which helps the local businesses wherever those projects are happening. And the families who benefit from having money in the pocket and money in the bank. So here we are again, where it's just frustrating to try to understand the logic of a chamber of commerce that would be against something like this. I understand the size of the spending in this bill. But take into consideration, as you mentioned, we did nothing on infrastructure over the last 4 years. And and we have engineers and architects who have been telling us for 20 to 25 years that we need to do something. So why not take advantage of it now and put money in the pockets of people who are working on some of these big projects, or who would be if we could get to some kind of agreement that we need to upgrade and repair our infrastructure. It seems to me it would be good for everybody, regardless of political party.
You would think.
Yeah, I know. Right. I know. It defies common sense to be
all
against.
Right. Well, that brings us to the next topic, actually. And the next topic being inflation. The former Treasury Secretary, Lawrence Summers, has made warnings and warns again that there are signs of inflation in the works. And he's concerned about the impact of the last COVID bill. He's not as concerned about the infrastructure bill, and I'll explain a little bit why in a minute. But he's looking at the housing prices going up. He's looking at the commodities market, and he's looking at what he calls the shrinking the labor force, inadequate labor force. I mean, that tells me that it's always really annoying when economists like this, neoliberal, even if their politics are otherwise okay, that they view full employment as a bad thing, because it means that workers have some control and can demand higher wages, which means inflation. Well, first of all, as we'll talk about, we can use some inflation right now. We have not had an inflation problem since before the 2008 crash. I mean, it has been, and we've talked about about how we weren't able to spend our way out of this stuff, and so with inflation, the reason he doesn't oppose the infrastructure bill is because it's not just money going into consumer hands to be spent. That's what he's considered as inflationary. It's not going to have any enough stimulative impact to overwhelm and to control. No, pardon me. He's worried to have hyper-stimulative impact. And whereas the infrastructure, a lot of that money goes into materials to be built for building. It's not all going into the hands of consumers. It's going into capital and private companies and the rest. So it's more capital intensive than labor intensive, although the infrastructure plans are intended to stimulate the economy. That's another function of the infrastructure plan that the Republicans don't want any part of, because they don't believe in Keynesianism, and they don't, they believe in supply side, even after it's failed over all these times. So anyway, there is this warning that we might move into inflation. I'll believe it when I see it. We haven't seen it in a long time. But even if there is some inflation, that's not necessarily a bad thing. We can use it. We need to inflate the economy. It's deflated right now.
Well, of course it is, and there's one huge reason for it right now. And you're right. We haven't had much movement on any of this since the 2008 crash. We all remember that. But let's not forget that over the last more than a year, we've been in a pandemic when a lot of people, lost their jobs, lost their businesses, or have had their hours reduced, their pay cut in order to keep a few people employed and so on. So the result of that, according to what I've been reading, is that a lot of people put off especially large purchases, like whether that's appliances or cars or things like that. So there's a lot of pent up demand in the consumer sector. So you're right, we should expect some inflation simply because there's so much demand out there for all kinds of things. And so I don't think we should be surprised about that. And I agree, it might even be good for us for right now.
Yeah, and it's something we need to do. We always need to watch it. And, he's the former Treasury Secretary. They tend to be, along with the Federal Reserve people, tend to be obsessed with inflation and ready to increase interest rates in order to lead to more unemployment. I mean, that's ironic. We have our idea of a healthy economy is if there is a high supply of labor, available labor, so that we can basically force them to accept jobs at pay that is less. And so it's always the worker who has to, foot the bill to make sure we don't have inflation. It's never capital or, those who own for a living who have to cut back on their their economic activity. It's always the worker, and that's my problem with it. But like he said, he is supporting the infrastructure bill, which could restructure the economy. Has no problem with that. Right. I just think we need to take a look at it. I think we need to be concerned about inflation, but there's ways you can control inflation. You can increase the interest rates. That would lower price of housing because it would make loans harder to get or less enticing. And the rest, it's a very simple solution for that aspect of it. And like I said, if we have investment that's looking at restructuring the economy and building it from the ground up right now after the pandemic, making sure that we actually hire people. I'm noticing a lot of restaurants aren't rushing back to having patrons in the restaurants. Right. They've been making so much money the other way. I think that there's going to be a point of diminishing returns there. People are going to want to be able to go sit in a restaurant, enjoy a cup of coffee, and and have their food warm. And so, some of them might get caught a little bit behind. Maybe not all of them. I could see some Chinese places saying, we don't really need a restaurant. Why don't we move into a smaller place where it's all a kitchen and a front counter? I mean, I can see that happening, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But, anyway, that's
you mentioned interest rates, and like you, I'm always concerned about that. But there are folks who have been writing recently, just in the last month or so, that interest rates are so low right now, there is some room. There is some room. Of course, the problem is once that gets started, what's to stop it from going up every quarter or, at least every couple of quarters or something. But there is some room for that. So maybe that would be a way to control it in the beginning. I worry, though, that once rates start going up, it makes it much more easier for them to raise it and raise it and raise it. So, that's a concern. But there are folks out there who are pointing out that there is a little bit of room there, given the rates that have been with us for quite a long time.
For a long time.
Yeah.
We do have to be careful because there was something that happened in the late 70s referred to as stagflation, where you had both stagnation and inflation, and that is just a horrible thing to be under. That had a lot to do with oil prices going up and a lot of other things, but it also had to do with the Federal Reserve that was a little quick to raise interest rates just to prevent inflation. And
it wasn't unusual to see rates at that point at 18%, 19%, I believe 21 at one point, wasn't it? So no, we definitely do not want that.
Today, we celebrate the triumph not of a candidate, but of a cause. The cause of democracy.
We are going to raise issues that, historically have not been raised.
What about the nuclear option, doing away with the filibuster? I can tell you that would be the end of the Senate as it was originally devised.
All of this is possible for America. Who was standing in the way? Mitch McConnell.
Where an insurrection that sought to overturn an election, when that failed, the action moved into state capitals.
Our last topic is, I wanted to do a little bit of a counter because in all of the red states where Republicans have power, they are pushing suppression bills which make it harder to vote, lessening time for early voting, allowing the state to take control over local elections if they don't like the results happening, or their candidate doesn't. Everything from passing laws to make it illegal to bring food and water to people waiting in long lines that shouldn't even exist if there was adequate voting facilities, all kinds of things. I mean, just looking for any way to have fewer votes, particularly votes of color, working class votes in the right areas and elderly. The Democrats in their states are expanding voter rights.
Right.
Same day voting, motor voter, where you're registered to vote when you get a driver's license if you want it. Increasing mail-in voting, looking into possibilities of even voting online in a secure way. I mean, you've got the blue and red Americas moving in diametrically opposite directions, and it could be that we have a two-tiered system, where people aren't voting, and one where in blue states where a lot of people are voting, and you might have even more ridiculously imbalanced elections where possibly Republicans win with like 5, 6, 7% fewer voters across the board because the blue voters aren't able to vote in the red states, and everybody's being allowed to vote in the blue states. It's going to be a very interesting contrast with all these bills passing, and of course we don't know what's going to happen with the federal bill if that can pass. Yeah.
Right. Well, the Republican plan, at least as I see it, is this: the Republican base is shrinking demographically. We know that. Republicans know that. They, as we've mentioned before on this program, they see the same numbers we see. The Republican base is shrinking. So what they've decided to do, instead of competing in the market of ideas and public policy, they've decided to try to prevent other people from voting. So that's what's going on. In fact, there was a study I just read about last night, released by Target Smart, that kind of pointed this out. Some of the white voters who tend to vote Republican in 2016 and 2020 decreased in number by about 4%.
Right.
While at the same time, some of the constituencies that tend to vote blue have increased in some places, not nationwide, but in some places as much as 43%. Also, we know how dependent Republicans are on the evangelical Christian vote. And recent studies have shown that there now fewer than half of Americans identify with any organized religion or attend any services on a regular basis.
Right.
Republicans see that as well. So what you have is a shrinking cohort on the right and a growing constituency on the left. So the Republicans have two choices. They can update their ideas and get back into the competition of public policy proposals and ideas, or they can try to reduce the number of people who can vote in this country. As of right now, they've chosen to try to reduce the number of people who can participate.
Absolutely. And I mean, we'll see. Now, I don't know if there's battleground states where, there could be competing bills. Wisconsin obviously is a battleground state. Right now, the Republicans control the legislature, but that may not last. And we've seen the Republicans do this. They get into power, and then when a Democrat is elected governor, they immediately go to take power away from the governor, right? And some of them are being challenged for their constitutionality. There's a very interesting discussion. We don't have time for it, but McConnell, in his state of Kentucky, they passed a law that basically says that the governor can pick three, are limited, have to pick somebody from the same party as the person who's replaced. Let's say a senator or a congressman retires early or is removed from office or dies or whatever, and the governor has to pick it. It says that they have to pick somebody from the same party for Congress or the Senate, and not only that, the majority party in the legislature gets to propose three people, and the governor has to prepare from that. Now, it probably won't survive constitutional muster because the Constitution states that the governor gets to choose. It doesn't give any power of the legislatures to choose, but the governors in each state choose that. So it may be what will happen if that ever happens, if something happens to Mitch McConnell, that Democratic governor is going to ignore that law altogether and appoint somebody that he wants, and then they'll have to sue. And we'll see what the Supreme Court says about it. But it's hard for me to see how one of those conservatives, constitutional purists like Clarence Thomas will go along with the Republican argument there. But it would be total hypocrisy. Not that we haven't seen that.
Well, yeah, and if those cases made it to the U.S. Supreme Court, you're absolutely right. But this gets to something that's a little bit below the surface. And you mentioned Wisconsin, and this problem has come up in Wisconsin before, and that is where something is decided upon either by the citizens of the state or the state legislature, but because of the emphasis Republicans have placed on the judiciary over the last however many decades, in a lot of states, you find very conservative state Supreme Courts who make the initial decisions on some of these things. So it points out how important it is for everybody to vote, because there are points in our mechanism, like state Supreme Court justices, that can make a difference. And that's why Republicans have placed so much emphasis on it over the last however many decades.
Right. And I need to correct. The Constitution doesn't say that the governor chooses automatically. Says that the legislature can empower the government to vote, but it doesn't say it can have any say on how the governor appoints it. I just wanted to clarify that. You're right. I mean, this is about enfranchisement. One side, we're divided into two basic ideologies in this country, give or take. There's a lot of variance, but we have one that wants to expand the voting base because it's in their interest, and one that wants to shrink it. And that's where we're at right now. It's a very strange place to be. We'll see where this Federal Voting Rights Act goes, an attempt to revitalize the Voting Rights Act, which is good.
Strange, you're right. And I think not reconcilable. I think it's going to take a continued reduction in the number of Republican voters. I think time, as a lot of folks we've talked with suggest, maybe time is the only thing that solves this problem. I don't know.
Maybe. It also, when they've tried to suppress the vote in Georgia, it just keeps leading to more African-American voters. They may be doing the Democrats a favor there. And if more and more African-American voters vote, the Republicans could lose their majority in Georgia at some point, especially.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. All of the voter suppression problems that we see in the various states fires up the left. There's no doubt about it. And it raised the level of awareness that Democrats have of people like Stacey Abrams and how important organization is. So there's more fallout. It has taught the left that we need to be much more organized. And the proof is in the state of Georgia.
Yeah, as opposed to Florida, where the Democratic Party organization is anemic. They can't even get a candidate up, that's a decent one. So anyway. I believe that brings us to our predictions. Chuck, what have you got?
Well, I've got two quick ones. The first one is kind of a follow-up on one from several weeks ago when I mentioned, and you just mentioned, Florida. The governor in Florida, Ron DeSantis, his profile in the Republican Party continues to be growing and more attractive to Republican voters all over the country. There are kind of below the radar surveys that are going on all over the country on the right, and his name comes up a lot, sometimes at the top of the list for the next presidential cycle. So we'll see about that. I would not be surprised about that. Much more immediate right now, though, I do predict that we will see inflation. How obvious it's going to be and exactly when, but I would say in the fall, because we will be hopefully closer back to a new normal, whatever that is, by the fall or the winter. So I think we will see some inflation. And actually, as you said earlier, we probably need it.
I want to go back to your DeSantis analysis. Unfortunately, he's looking really good right now. I think 60 Minutes, the gold standard of journalism, really messed up on this one. I mean, they accused him because this pharmaceutical company, I'm even forgetting their name, but it was that gave him a lot of money, was given a real the primary distribution of one of the vaccines, and And as it turns out, of course, it was fair to investigate it because a lot of money going there has to, it does suggest a little bit of that maybe there was quid pro quo there. The problem is that the suggestion didn't come from DeSantis to hire them. It actually came from Democrats and some mayors who are saying they're ready to do some distribution. And even the rest of the media is kind of turning on 60 Minutes. They covered his press conference, did some real selective editing. This all fits into the whole liberal plot to take down conservatives, and they don't like DeSantis because he might be the next Trump kind of a thing. And all it did was help him. That was a big, mistake on their part, unethical, and we need to look at it because it looks like he'll probably be reelected.
Well, one quick thing, I know we got to get to your prediction, but you're spot on right. And what a lot of people are saying in these kind of under the radar surveys is that DeSantis seems to them to be Trump who knows how to behave when the camera is on and doesn't have all the baggage. So there you go.
Well, yeah. And and more to the point, he's possibly going to be the presidential candidate in 2024. He could be the anti-Trump, right? And we'll see. It's all going to depend, though. I noticed that COVID cases are increasing a bit in Florida. Will they get serious with the variants and all that? A lot of it's going to depend on that. He's been kind of lucky, but it's not one of the best states. It's not horrible, but it's not one of the best states for.
Well, one more wrinkle in that, we still don't know for sure whether Donald Trump is or isn't running. Most people say he's not, that he's just saying he is to continue to raise money. But we don't know for sure. He hasn't said. And what happens if he does? Does Ron DeSantis, who wants to be president, all of a sudden just step down and say, well, I can't run? That's what Nikki Haley recently did, said she would vote for Trump. But would somebody like DeSantis, who's ambitious, do that? See, that's my analysis. I think that there are so many egos in politics and so many people who think from time to time that it's their turn, that it doesn't matter who announces. Their ego is going to make them announce. So I cannot see a single candidate like Donald Trump, when there's not an incumbent Republican in the White House, just all of a sudden being handed the nomination. That just goes against my own political analysis. I can't see the seas parting just for Donald Trump and everybody else stepping aside. I just don't see that.
All right, my prediction. I'm looking at this and seeing what some of the convictions have been in the past for similar things and the sentencing. But going back to the Chauvin sentencing, he's going to be sentenced, I believe, in June. The maximum was 40. You got 40 for the second degree, I think 20 for the third degree, I think 10 for the manslaughter, but you can't stack them all on top of each other because it's actually 3 crimes for the same act. They really want them to have all 3 of them because, well, first of all, they want to have it in there as a backup. They wanted to get something in case the jury was wavering at all and they might feel like, oh, let's give them manslaughter. They didn't. They went on all 3 of them. I mean, it shocked everybody. But I believe that that he will be sentenced to about 15 years, not the 40 maximum, not even half of it. He'll be sentenced to about 15 years. That's what I'm expecting. It'll disappoint a lot of people, might even lead to a little bit of, white privilege and all of that, the claims of that, which, are true. But it's also based on this judge's his comments about Maxine Waters that we discussed earlier in the show, and some other concerns I have about how the trial went. I don't think he sees this guy as a bad guy in the same sense that others of us do.
Well, one quick question there. Let's say you're right, and he is sentenced to 15 years. How much of that would he have to serve before being eligible for parole?
I don't know what the rule is in Minnesota. In California, you could get out with half time on good behavior, except I don't know if that applies to murder cases. So I'm not sure what the rules are in there, but in most cases it would mean he doesn't have to be in there the whole time. I'm not sure even what's appropriate. I'm not somebody who believes in long prison sentences, to be honest. I would. In France, for instance, the maximum sentence is 35 years. Some European countries, it's even lower. So, 15 years, it's not like he's getting away with something. That's a good part of his life, right? So, but in contrast to other people who are charged with similar crimes, it would be seen as inequitable, and I would see it that way. But I don't think he's going to get the minimum. I don't think he'll get the minimum of 10 years. Anyway, I think he'll go a little bit above, maybe 20, but I think closer to 15. All right, that is our show for tonight. And until then, keep thinking.